Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 53 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Calgary Flames, in which the Sharks have won 6-3. Now, as we know, the Sharks are a bad team. To put it bluntly, the Sharks are not very good. You could argue that perhaps they are slightly better than what their standings position would indicate, but realistically, only by a couple of spots, and pretty much in every scenario that you would have run this season again, the Sharks would find themselves in the bottom five for sure. Having said that, though, the Sharks, I think there is also not too much denying that can be done. We're also relatively unlucky thus far this season, and it can certainly go back to the classic saying of you have to be lucky to be good, but you also have to be good to be lucky. That is definitely something. Perhaps the Sharks just haven't really done enough to create opportunities to get lucky, but it has felt as though in many of the games that they have played this season, things could have perhaps gone the Sharks' way, maybe even just to get a singular point out of it if they got a few better bounces. What they also say when it comes to the hockey world is what goes around comes around. Whenever you get some bad luck or some bad officiating, there's always some game in the future that evens that out. Well, tonight, that was that game. The San Jose Sharks definitely found themselves pretty lucky multiple times this game, allowing them to get this victory. Now, this is not to say that the Sharks got heavily outplayed by Calgary, and the only reason they won is because they just squeaked out a victory. In fact, as the Sharks piled on more and more goals in this game, they actually seemed to get more and more confidence behind them, which allowed them to play better as this game did go on. But for instance, in the second period, I wouldn't even necessarily say that the Sharks were so good and that's why they managed to outscore the Flames by such a wide margin, but instead a combination of the Sharks getting pretty fortunate and the Flames essentially shooting themselves in their own foot allowed them to take that lead. But let us start off instead in the first period, as this game seemed to be going a similar way to that of the Jets game just 24 hours ago. It starts off with the Sharks getting the first 3 shots of the game, and then the Flames pretty much take over the remainder of the first period. While it won't be as lopsided, as embarrassing as the first period last game against the Jets, as the Sharks did manage to get a few shots here or there, the Calgary Flames controlled the first 20 minutes of this game and scored the only goal in the first period, coming from Nazem Kadri, to make it 1-0 Calgary heading into the second period. And this is where things kind of fell apart for Calgary and where the Sharks managed to take advantage. And if we look at each of these goals individually, you can see exactly why. So the first one is scored by Mikael Granlund, and it is the Calgary Flames defenseman, I believe it was Noah Hannafin, who gives this puck straight away. This allows the Sharks to get some quick possession as they're going for a change, which also makes it difficult for Calgary to cover. And then it is the Flames goaltender who seemingly falls in his own crease, which doesn't allow him to make much of an effort on this Granlund goal to make it 1-0 San Jose. Then on the second one, scored by Justin Bailey, it is yet another giveaway. This time a Flames pass seems to hit off of the back of another Flames player, which then goes straight to Justin Bailey, who then feeds to Filip Zadina, right back to Justin Bailey to make it 2-0 San Jose. And then the third goal here by Luke Cunnin. This is a pretty basic shot that comes towards the net. Seems like a very easy save for the Flames goaltender, but then as the puck is sort of squeaking its way away from Wolf, Flames defenseman Chris Tanev decides to try and sort of push it under his goaltender like you might see dozens of times per game to get the freeze, but he ends up putting it into his own net just barely over the goal line, and that makes it 3-0 3-1 I should say, completely out of nowhere. So definitely some pretty good luck on the Sharks side, who up to that point hadn't necessarily been playing that great of a second period, but a second period that they capitalized on the chances that the Flames, I guess, gave to them. The Flames would bring this back to within 1 with a goal late in the second period. That would be with about 20 seconds or so to go, so it made it kind of dangerous for San Jose. You never want to be giving up these late period goals, and so we would then head into the third period, and this is where it really, again, opened up for San Jose. It was the first one that I would say is slightly a bit fortunate here for the San Jose Sharks. A very nice deflection, but not not in the traditional sense when it comes to Zadina. This one goes off of like the top, or the mid part, I should say, of his stick, not the blade like you would expect usually. And then it becomes like a floating puck that the goaltender for the Flames cannot spot, and it just kind of goes right over, lobs over his head and into the net, just like at the top near the crossbar. So a very weird goal for sure that made it 4-2 San Jose. But finally, once that goal was established, it felt as though the Sharks said, hey, wait a minute, we're actually winning this game. We can win this game if we close it out well. And that's when the Sharks started to come alive. And these last couple of goals were definitely a bit more hard work, I guess you could say. At least the fifth one for sure. This one coming from Zadina to make it 5-2. The Cunnin one, another pretty bad giveaway here from the Calgary Flames, but at least this one felt a more involved for San Jose, that they had to make a bit more of an effort when it comes to Luke Cunnin to be able to turn this one over, and that made it 6-2. The Flames would add a goal at the end of the third period, just kind of there in the last few minutes, that made it potentially somewhat interesting, but realistically not much doing, and the Sharks close it out 6-3. Moving on to the players to talk about, we once again have the top line of Duclair, Granlund, and Zetterlund, and you would expect in a game in which the Sharks score 6 goals with no Logan Couture or no Tomas Hertl in the lineup that it must be these three players pulling the weight offensively for San Jose, and that was very clearly not the case. The one goal that this line actually managed to score, which was the first goal from Granlund, wasn't even really this line, and it was a partial change which ended up with Zadina finding himself on the ice with Granlund just coming off the bench. That got the Sharks on the board originally. Other than that, this first line did not really factor into much of anything for San Jose. And that definitely starts, in my opinion, with the two wingers on this line. The first one here being Anthony Duclair, in a game in which the Sharks, again, a lot of offense and was kind of open with the Flames making a ton of mistakes. Duclair never really got to be the beneficiary of any of those errors, and Duclair just not apparent for once again another game this season. And as we get closer and closer to that trade deadline, just a couple of weeks away, the Sharks are on their knees praying that Duclair will at some point manage to show up in like one or a couple of these games to show off some sort of value for any team looking to potentially pick him up, and it's just at the moment not there. A scout in the stands of this game watching Anthony Duclair is not going to be blown away at all by his performance. In fact, they'll probably have been rather bored by his performance here tonight. And with Zetterlund, I will say it's not as bad as Duclair, as I thought Zetterlund was slightly more involved, but really not by all that wide of a margin, and this first line was definitely not much of a factor at all through much of this game. When it comes to this second line, this is where things did take a turn for the better for San Jose in comparison to the first line at least. We have Eklund, Barabanov, and Cunnin. It is the exact same forward group that the Sharks were running yesterday against the Winnipeg Jets, interestingly enough, even though the Sharks managed 0 goals in that particular game. And this one started off somewhat poorly for this line, and in particular for William Eklund. It felt as though, I think it was the first or maybe second shift of the game, this line got caught on for a good 90 seconds. Eklund even had an opportunity to clear the puck, held it with possession, but gave it straight away to a Flames player, which just extended the shift by another like 30-40 seconds in his own zone. So that was a bit of a rough look. Then Eklund ends up giving the puck away near the offensive zone blue line, which caused a rush going the other way, which led to the Nazem Kadri goal. So very much not a good start to this game for Eklund. And that was definitely a time where Eklund may have just sort of shut down a bit. Maybe even David Quinn would lose some faith in him, bench him somewhat, and he'd end up with like a pretty bad game by the end of the night. But that definitely did not happen. Eklund had a full turnaround. It ended up being one of the Sharks' better forwards of the night, in my opinion. Had a few really strong shifts, especially later in the game, where he was just making multiple amazing passes through traffic. And while none of them would necessarily set up a goal, he ends up with an assist on the Cunnin one, but not exactly his most beautiful assist of the night. He came very, very close to setting up multiple players. For instance, Zadina, who almost got a hat trick in this game, thanks to a great pass from William Eklund that he was just unable to bury. But I thought really solid finish to this game for Eklund. When it comes to his two line mates, I will say Barabanov was definitely more of a positive this game than he has been in so many of the games he has played this season. Not only did he show a couple of flashes, though nothing consistent, of course, from an offensive perspective, he also had a very nice defensive play. When the Sharks gave up a 2-on-0 in a 4-on-4 situation, Barabanov gets on his horse and races all the way back to get a stick on this puck, which prevented a pretty easy otherwise tap-in goal for the Flames. That could have definitely changed the pace of this game, but because of that heroic play from Barabanov, it stopped it. So, like I said with Duclair, if there is a scout in the stands watching Barabanov, perhaps there is maybe a bit of interest being generated there. When it comes to the other winger on this line, Luke Cunnin, he had 2 goals. You got to commend him for that. Was the first one like the way he drew it up? Obviously not. That's kind of a very lucky one. But like I said, made a decent play to get this 6th goal for the San Jose Sharks, and it was also an extremely nice shot as well. So a solid game for Luke Cunnin. Then we get to the third line, and this third line was just not very apparent at all. When it comes to Mike Hoffman, I didn't even notice that he was in this game until about 2 minutes left in the second period when the Sharks got a power play, and I said, hey, wait a minute, Hoffman is playing? That's pretty weird. The same could definitely be said about Jacob McDonald, who also didn't make much of an impact, and Nico Sturm, who at the very least, luckily for San Jose, is in the lineup after an injury scare yesterday against the Winnipeg Jets. That's a good thing, and I will also commend Nico Sturm for his penalty kill performance here tonight. The Sharks did a pretty good job with a relatively tough Calgary Flames power play, but at even strength, this third line just did nothing. Then, of course, we get to the story of the night, and that is the fourth line here for San Jose, and perhaps in particular Filip Zadina. Now, interestingly enough, if you go through these first couple of periods, he does pick up a couple of assists, the one on Granlund and the one on Justin Bailey, but it was hard to kind of describe those first 40 minutes as super impactful from Zadina's perspective. Yes, he managed to take advantage of a couple of Calgary Flames misplays, but when it came to actually working around in the offensive zone, there wasn't a ton doing for him. But like I mentioned earlier with the San Jose Sharks generally gaining confidence because of the fact that they were getting these lucky bounces, Zadina definitely amplifies that, or exemplifies that to perfection, because once he especially picked up this first goal of the game, his third point with that weird deflection play over the Flames goaltender, immediately after that, Zadina just became a force in the offensive zone with multiple very good shifts there, coming oh so close to actually getting a hat-trick goal, because he did, of course, add a second goal and a 4th point on the night. So a very good finish to this night for sure for Filip Zadina. The first 40 minutes weren't necessarily outstanding, but those last 20 minutes are something that Zadina is going to want to sort of capture, put in a bottle, and manage to bring that forward into the rest of this season. This is exactly the Filip Zadina that the Sharks were hoping that they would get when they signed him after he left the Detroit Red Wings, and maybe this is the start of things to come. Maybe it's a bit of a fluke, but it was definitely still a very nice game to watch from him. When it comes to the two other forwards on this line, Ryan Carpenter didn't exactly do too much, but you do also have to commend Justin Bailey, the other winger on this line. Perhaps indeed it was Zadina who did steal the show, but Bailey gets a goal, a couple of assists, 3 points on the night for a player who started this season in the AHL with perhaps not really too many dreams of making it to the NHL again at some point this year, but because the Sharks are pretty lacking in terms of actual offensive talent, plus the fact that they've had multiple injuries this season, he has found a home, and he's been doing a very good job with that role. Then we move on to the defensive side of things. At the top, we have Ferraro and Ruda. I will say a pretty decent game. The only thing that I will say about Jan Ruda, a few pretty key misplays in the defensive zone, or in the neutral zone, I should say, as well as near the blue line, which caused some odd man rushes going the other way. It felt as though Ruda was a bit too excited to actually get up offensively, which caused him to slightly abandon his defensive positionings at time. I will say generally he played a pretty solid game, but definitely a few key mistakes that do need to be cleaned up. His partner Mario Ferraro, I actually thought had a pretty good game, not super apparent, but relatively solid, as they didn't necessarily give the Flames a ton to work with here tonight, at least a lot less than they gave the Jets yesterday. When it comes to the second pairing, we have Vlasic and Emberson, and Vlasic is continuing to really be the Vlasic of old, where you're kind of left at the end of a 60-minute game saying, wait a minute, Vlasic played? But unlike when I mentioned that to Mike Hoffman, who is a scoring forward who you're hoping you will notice, when it comes to saying that about Marc-Edouard Vlasic, a defensive defenseman, when you can say those words about someone, it means that they did play well because you didn't notice them in a negative sense. And that's exactly what was here the case for Vlasic, one of the Sharks' better defenders on the night, just generally a really solid performance. And then when it comes to the third pairing here tonight between Addison and Burrows, the good news, they were better. It would have been hard to be worse, but they were better than what they were last night against the Winnipeg Jets. But unless the Sharks don't actually have a better option, I know Thrun is injured. I don't know exactly the case with Ahatyuk, for instance, but perhaps he may be injured as well. Unless the Sharks don't have a better option, I was surprised to see both of them in the lineup, and while I do think they redeemed themselves slightly, they were likely still the weakest defensive pairing for the San Jose Sharks. It's just not fantastic. With Calen Addison, I do think he was okay-ish defensively, but the major thing that I'm continuing to notice about Addison, he came advertised as an offensive defenseman. There is just nothing of that doing. He is even getting top power play minutes due to the fact that both Hertl and Couture are injured, so there are some spots to fill in, and he's not really rolling with that opportunity at all. And then finally, we have the goaltender for the Sharks. That would be Mackenzie Blackwood. Perhaps not as outstanding as a night as his counterpart did yesterday with Kaapo Kähkönen, but Blackwood does at the very least get the win on the night, letting in 3 goals. Didn't really have much of a chance on the Kadri one, didn't really have much of a chance on the Kuzmenko one either. Really only the second goal maybe he could have had, but even that's a bit of a stretch. I'd say generally a rather solid game for Blackwood and a generally solid game for the Sharks as a whole. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Saturday, where they'll be taking on the Columbus Blue Jackets. There's really not much of a history between these teams, not much of a rivalry between these teams, but the Sharks, you could say, are theoretically competing with the Blue Jackets for a low enough spot in the standings. If the Sharks actually continue to win games like they were doing prior to the All-Star break and like they did here tonight, maybe that is something that comes into play here. So at the end of the day, you could even describe this one as a 4-point game. Class dismissed.